The Detroit Tigers finally came to the realization that their multi-talented designated hitter, Victor Martinez, is no longer healthy and can no longer play through the pain. So what does that mean for the Tigers' everyday lineup? And how is the recovery from Justin Verlander going as well? I pose those questions to Matt Mowery, a Tigers beat writer for the Oakland Press. And here's what he had to say on the topic. So first of all, welcome to the Two-Man Advantage Podcast, and thank you for joining us this afternoon.
Well, thanks for having me.
So it's clear that Victor Martinez isn't his normal self, only with one home run and batting .216. So do you think it was a smart move for the Tigers to shut him down to make sure they get him back to as close to 100% as possible?
Yeah, I think it was. All along, they'd been operating under the principle that he couldn't make the knee any worse. And I don't think he was really making the knee any worse in the sense that he was injuring it. There was just a lot of inflammation in the left knee, and so every time he was trying to load up from the left-hand side to hit, he really couldn't support his weight on that back leg. So he was swinging all arms from the left-hand side. So yeah, the longer they can live without him in the interim, I guess, just so they can try to get him back as close to normal as possible, the better it will be, because clearly they're going to need him down the stretch run and they're going to need him in the playoffs. So the longer they can go and kind of tread water here in the middle of the season and hope to get him better, the better off they'll be in the long run.
And tell me, how do you think the Tigers should judge success without him in the lineup?
Well, I think, like I said, if they're going to tread water for a little while without him in the lineup and kind of, not necessarily play 500, but a little slightly over 500, I think that's probably not what they should hope for, but I don't think that's the worst case scenario. Worst case scenario is obviously if they start losing a bunch of games because they don't have protection for Miguel Cabrera in the lineup and they don't have a way to drive in runs. They've done okay so far for the last couple of games where they haven't had him, for the games in St. Louis where they didn't really have him, and the last couple of days they've done pretty well. JD Martinez isn't obviously Victor Martinez, but he's doing a pretty good impersonation in that spot in the lineup, and they're going to have to get along with them for a little while here. So I don't know that it's the worst if they do play somewhere close to 500, because honestly they were playing somewhere close to 500 for the last 3, 4, 5 weeks, even with Victor in the lineup.
And tell me, how does the lineup change without Martinez in the lineup?
Well, one of the things that's really been a problem for them, and it was even with him in the lineup, simply because he was struggling so much from the left-hand side, they're really, really being dominated by soft-tossing right-handed pitchers, if you've noticed over the last couple of weeks. It's because they really don't have any left-handed bats in the lineup. Aside from Anthony Gose at the top of the lineup, without Martinez and without Alex Avila, they're really, really right-hand dependent. And that's why one of the factors when they were trying to decide who to bring up from the minors to replace Victor in the short term, they settled on a guy like Tyler Collins, who has a little bit of pop from the left-hand side and can maybe help balance out the lineup a little bit. The lineup is going to be, very right-hand oriented, even with Avila and with Martinez, but they got to balance it as much as they possibly can without those two right now. And, adding a guy like Tyler Collins probably isn't a full solution. I don't think anybody expects Tyler to be the savior of the club or anything, but at least it gives them a little more balance so that, some of the soft tossing right-handers that have really given them trouble over the last, 4 or 5 weeks, they can maybe have a better chance against those guys.
And tell me, switching gears a little bit, I know that Justin Verlander and Bruce Rondon recently both threw a bullpen session. So can you give me sort of a progress report on where those two are and how close they are to returning to the Tigers?
Well, actually, Rondon just threw in a game with the Mud Hens on a rehabilitation assignment last night. From all reports, he looked like a guy on a rehabilitation assignment. His first pitch was hit, back up the middle by Jose Reyes, who's also on a rehab assignment, and that ended up being the go-ahead run. So Bruce was charged with a blown save, and from what Larry Parrish, the manager, was telling the reporters down there, he looked like a guy who'd been on the shelf for a while. He didn't have a whole lot of control, but the arm strength is there. He was still pumping it in the 90s, the high 90s, like you expect from him. So what they're going to have from him is they're going to have him throw again Sunday in Toledo. And then at some point on the next road trip for the Mud Hens, he's going to have to throw back-to-back nights. That's going to be the proof in the pudding for whether or not Rondon is ready to come back. If he can throw back-to-back games and still come out fine, then he'll be ready to go and he'll be back with the Tigers. Now, when that is, that may be still a week or so yet. I'm not exactly positive. No one is. It's going to be based on how he feels, but it could be sooner rather than later. With Verlander, he's progressing pretty well. Today, he's actually supposed to throw a bullpen where he gets up and down, to simulate what you would do between an inning. And it'll allow him to see how he feels after he sits down and cools down a little bit and then gets back up and throws again, to see how the arm responds to that. And then the next step after that will be doing that a little more with maybe a simulated game where you throw, 15, 20 pitches, sit down, get back up, throw 15, 20 pitches. So they're incrementally building up the number of pitches he's throwing, but today is just kind of a rather limited. They'll throw the full whatever he would throw in a pregame routine, about 40 pitches, and then they'll probably throw 15 more on top of that, once he sits down and cools down and then gets back up. So Verlander's progressing as well. He's probably not quite as close to a return as Rondon is, but he's getting closer. Certainly it's probably only another couple of steps for him. It's probably with a simulated game next, and then maybe possibly, if that goes well, a rehab start, and then maybe another rehab start. They're not sure on how long he'd have to be in the minors, but they're both getting relatively close.
And just one follow-up on pitching for you. Could you just give me an idea of where you think the Tigers bullpen is as a whole? Obviously, it's not the best bullpen in the world, and sooner rather than later, it's going to cost them some games. But can you give me an idea of where you think the bullpen is and how they've performed so far this season?
Well, to give you kind of an indirect answer, it's probably better than we think it is, and it's probably a little worse than it appears, if that makes any sense. Statistically, right now, it looks pretty good because the Tigers starting pitchers have gone the deepest in games of almost anybody in the majors. So the Tigers bullpen hasn't been overworked so far, and that's really, really been a big bonus because it's been able to be used as it's supposed to be used. It hasn't been overused, it hasn't been abused, it hasn't been stretched thin at any point. So it's really been, you've been able to a lot of times go starter and then Soria, or starter setup guy and then Soria, instead of having to have. Really, the problems usually come in when you have to have a guy come in the fifth, or a guy go fifth, sixth, or a guy, three different guys go fifth, sixth, seventh. That's when the problems come in, because those are not the best relievers that you have on the team. Those guys that are in the earlier innings, those guys haven't had to be used all that often, and they haven't been used in situations that have been detrimental to the team. That said, they've had a couple of surprises, with a guy like Alex Wilson that they got in the Porcello trade. He's been a pretty pleasant surprise. He's been kind of a jack of all trades down there. And a guy like Angel Nesbitt has been a surprise. They weren't expecting anything out of him. They were just kind of predicting he would go down in the minors and get another year of seasoning. He's been a big surprise. So it's been a little better. And the big thing that has helped the bullpen most is that they have the ninth inning lockdown. With the exception of last night when Soria gave up the home run to blow his first save of the season, he's really been spotless. And so having that ninth inning lockdown like they haven't had in several years allows them to line up everything behind that, and allows guys to get in the proper roles and have an idea of what their role is. And that's allowed everybody to kind of slot perfectly behind Soria. So, like I said, it's been a little better than maybe we expected, and maybe a little better than even the talent says it should be. But it's also, it's got the potential down the road, like you said, if it gets in a situation where they have to overuse the bullpen, there's not a whole lot of depth in that bullpen, so it could end up costing them as much as we always worry that it might. If it ends up getting in a situation where it's had, it has to be used quite a bit.
And what are some storylines that you'll be watching to unfold throughout the course of this season and the remaining season with Detroit?
Well, obviously, once the Tigers get healthy, then it will be interesting to see how fast they can take off. Once they get Rondon and Verlander and Victor Martinez, all the guys we've been talking about on the shelf, once they get those core pieces back in place, and barring anybody else going on the DL, once they have everything together and their prime lineup together, it'll be interesting to see how fast they can take off, and if there's any if there's any deficit behind the Royals that they need to make up, because quite honestly, they've been playing a little bit handicapped by not having those guys in the lineup so far. So it's one where we're going to have to see how good they can be once they've got all the pieces together. Another storyline that I'm interested to follow all season long is exactly how good this defense is. It seems like it's very much improved over the last couple of years, particularly in the outfield and obviously up the middle with Iglesias, and having a kid behind the plate like Brian McCann who's got a cannon. You haven't had any drop off from Alex Avila as far as defensive skills behind the plate. So it'll be interesting to see if this is in any way, shape, or form a small sample size or a mirage that we've been seeing so far with the defense. It doesn't seem like it is, but it'll be interesting to watch that over the season to see how this defense plays over 162 games rather than just 41.
And what are some of the things that you've taken away from the early part of this season, both good and bad so far?
Well, I think one of the things that we were interested to see was one of the guys who showed up in the offseason. Well, a lot of guys showed up in the offseason, but one of them in particular that we had a lot of questions about was Anthony Gose, the center fielder. We knew he could play defense, and obviously that's a big part of why they've got him. But he's also surprisingly been able to hit, and that had always been the knock on him with Toronto, was that they weren't sure that the hit tool was going to play in the majors. So he's been able to kind of outperform his profile so far, and it'll be interesting to see how that continues the rest of the season. Another one to watch, obviously, is JD Martinez. There was a lot of question after last year about whether or not that was just a flash in the pan. He slumped mightily. He had that 0 for 25 streak where nothing was going right, and he struck out 16 times. But since then, until last night, I believe he was on a 10-game hit streak. So it's interesting to see how that's playing in the second year, to see if there is still an element of maybe we didn't see the real JD Martinez, or maybe we did last year, to kind of see how that goes. Those have been the things that so far I've been most impressed with.
And just finally, can you give me a thumbnail on how you think Brad Ausmus has transformed into the role of manager from his days as a player? How do you think he's doing so far?
Well, I think with any first-year manager, especially a guy like Ausmus who didn't have a whole lot of experience, he wasn't really a manager in the minor leagues. Really, his only managerial experience was with Team Israel in the World Baseball Classic. So he was not somebody who had a ton of experience and had been through all these things. He said all the right things last year as far as, saying that nothing surprised him and nothing came out of the blue and he was prepared for everything. But you can still see that there has been some growth, even from year to year and even from week to week. Sometimes there's some growth about, I did this thing and it didn't work so very well, so now I'm not going to do it again. Now, has he been perfect? Absolutely not. There have been a lot of times where you scratch your head about what he's doing. You scratch your head sometimes about bullpen management, but then you have to kind of realize, he's using what he's been given. So, yeah, he's not been perfect, and clearly, obviously, last year was a little bit of a disappointment the way it ended up, certainly. And even this year, he admitted the other day that this team is kind of underachieved. So I think, obviously, managers get a lot more credit sometimes than they deserve when teams win championships, and sometimes they get too much blame, more blame than they deserve. I don't know that he's necessarily gotten more blame than he deserves. He probably, deserves some of the criticism and some of the blame that he's gotten so far. But I don't think overall, on the whole, he's done a bad job. He's now a second year manager, and he's evolving into, a guy that has a little more experience and has, kind of some of those situations under his belt where he can call on previous experience and kind of learn from it and evolve. And he's shown the intelligence, and he's shown the ability to evolve, and he's shown that he's not too stubborn to evolve. Sometimes that's the problem. Even if somebody sees a problem, they don't necessarily have the willingness to change. And he's shown that he will change at times when it's necessary. I think one of the biggest tests probably was, to bring this full circle, was one of the things that we talked about very early in this podcast was that Victor Martinez didn't want to go on the DL. And I think if it were up to Victor, and Brad even said this, if it was up to Victor, he'd still be on the active roster. But it wasn't up to Victor. And that was kind of seriously a test of Ausmus's mettle as a manager for him to sit Victor down. And he said it was a very emotional conversation, but he sat Victor down and he said, this is what we're doing. And if you had any question about, him not being able to relate to the players or being too soft on the players because he was a former player himself, I don't think that's an issue. And I think that's one of those points that it kind of illustrates that, he's able to make the tough call and the tough decision. And he basically said that was his call. So I guess if you want an example of where maybe he's evolved over the last couple of the last 2 years, that's probably one of them.
One final follow-up in terms of the division. Do you see the Tigers, when it's all said and done, winning their fifth straight AL Central title? And how far do you think this team can go in the playoffs, assuming they get there?
Well, I think they do make the playoffs. I think the question is where they slot in. And I think at this point, when you look at the talent level on their team and the talent level on Kansas City's team, it's pretty close. So do I think they have the ability to win their fifth straight division title? Absolutely. Do I think they will? I think at this point, if you look at the way they've played through the first 40 games and the way Kansas City has played through the first 40 games, I don't think it's all that out of the ordinary or all that out of the blue to think that the Tigers may end up slotting in as the wild card team this time around. Now, does that mean that they can't make a deep run in the playoffs? No. Obviously, look at Kansas City last year. Kansas City got in on the wild card, and they did absolutely fabulously, making a run all the way to the seventh game of the World Series. The issue for the Tigers is going to be the pitching staff, particularly the starting pitching staff, but also the bullpen. Is this pitching staff, as remodeled as it is and as changed as it is from the last couple of years, is it the type of pitching staff that can get you through, a deep playoff run? As much as everybody wants to play down the fact that David Price hasn't done very well in the playoffs, David Price hasn't done very well in the playoffs. He had a pretty good start last year, certainly better than the other two that they had to start the playoff run, but he hasn't been necessarily that ace that you need in the playoffs. And the rest of the pitching staff, quite honestly, unless Verlander comes back and is the Verlander of old, the rest of the pitching staff hasn't necessarily shown that it's a lockdown pitching staff that's going to dominate the opposition in the playoffs. And I don't think it's any stretch to say that this is a somewhat diminished starting rotation that it has been in the last couple of years. So if they get there, do they have the ability to go deep? Yeah, I think they could. But I think it's probably going to take either, like I said, a Verlander coming back and being, closer to what he was in the past than he was over the last 2 years, or it's going to probably take a trade at the deadline to bolster that starting rotation to make that happen.
Matt, we thank you for your time this afternoon and for talking Tigers baseball with us on the Two Man Advantage podcast.
Not a problem. Thanks for having me.